Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true creepy backwoods stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true scary stories. This is a story from when I was in high school, around 2010-ish. My parents' house backs up to a small wooded area. It's not a forest by any means. There are walking trails and other neighborhoods around, but the woods are big enough that we used to see deer and the occasional fox. There was also a small creek that ran through it, and I used to spend time in the fall/winter poking around back there when it wasn't obscured by brush. I found what I assume was likely a deer path that ran all the way up to my old elementary school, which was about a block away via roads. But using the deer trails took about 10 to 15 minutes. I was back in this area fairly often, which is why the following story was so weird. I went down to the creek one day and followed the trail like normal, but this time I found a partial deer skeleton at the end. The head and the front legs were missing, but the rest was still there, and there was no flesh at all on the bones. They were stripped absolutely clean, and the bones were still a bright white. At the time, there weren't coyotes in the area like there are now, and I'd seen a bobcat once when I was little, but they definitely weren't very common. To this day, I have no idea how that skeleton got there or what happened to it. It was too clean to be a predator kill. And that also doesn't explain why the front half was missing. I got so freaked out that I never went back into those woods again. This took place in a residential area, not a hunting ground. It could have been a predator kill, sure, okay. But I'm positive that that thing wasn't killed by a human, not with houses and an elementary school literally across the creek. About a year ago, my girlfriend and I were on a trail to Lemuel Lake in northern Nevada. It's about 1.5 miles each way, I think, and usually pretty well populated. It was that day as well. There were at least a handful of people on the trail here and there, plenty down at the trailhead parking lot, and it was otherwise a totally normal sunny day. Evening began to come, and we started heading back down, not wanting to be out when it got dark, as there is no cell phone service up there for quite a distance, and it was just an afternoon weekend hike. We started down the trail, and I got the slightest hint of a bad feeling, like we definitely needed to get back in our car before it got dark. I think that's generally just common sense, and doesn't need to be prompted by a sixth sense or anything. Still, I kept an eye out as we went. Weirdly, absolutely nothing happened until we were maybe 300 yards from the parking lot. The trees had largely been left behind as we descended in elevation, and bushes, large and small, were there instead. There was a creek that ran through to our right. Ahead of us, by maybe 50 yards, was a lone woman and her medium-sized dog on a leash. I had my head on a swivel the whole way down, because I was just trying to keep an eye out and make sure that hint of a bad feeling didn't amount to anything. I was also carrying. This woman was ahead of us by about the same distance for a good while down the trail, and I felt somewhat responsible for her safety as well, if anything strange were to happen. Mountain lions are known to live higher up in those mountains, the Rubies, and she was pretty much in sight the whole time, so I was trying to help keep an eye out for her too. As we're walking, me and the girlfriend both hear what seemed like a big boulder sliding and grating along a stone surface. It lasted for a few seconds, and we were both looking at the stone surface mountain slope maybe 600 yards to our left. I'm bad at judging distances, but I think that might be close. Fully expecting to see a landslide of some sort. but there was nothing, and daylight was still good enough that if there was something to see on that front, we would have seen it. I immediately looked to the lady ahead of us, and just a second later, she and her dog started booking it. Right as they did this, a herd of deer came sprinting out of the bushes away from the boulder sound. It must have been closer than it sounded. They ran across the creek and kept going to our right. After pausing for a second to discuss what that weird sound might have been, we hurried along as well, and I drew my gun. We passed the same little section where the lady was when she took off, and thankfully nothing happened. We didn't hear or see anything in those bushes, though I'm not surprised. A whole herd of deer was in there, and we couldn't see them until they ran out, despite being at a higher elevation at the time. We quickly made it back to the parking lot, and I put my gun back in the holster. It felt safer getting back to the pavement for some reason. We caught up with the woman and the dog. She was catching her breath and pacing a little. We asked if she heard that weird sound, and she said that it sounded like a loud bouldery sound. And then off to her left, directly close by, right where the deer came running from, she distinctly heard a big low growl after the boulder sound, and then she heard the deer coming and ran to get out of the way. The deer probably would have just run right into her if she hadn't moved. Watching this happen from a ways above and behind just a minute or two previous, they came out onto the trail right where she had been a second before. We determined that it may have been a mountain lion. I'm all for believing that, but I still have two questions. One, why did I get the feeling that we needed to leave, even subtly, around 45 minutes before anything strange happened? And two, why and how did whatever it was make a big sound of a boulder scraping along? Not tumbling, but sliding. Very different sounds. And then there was a clear growl heard by the woman, but not by us. I think that indicates that there was something absolutely in those bushes, but I'm very confused about the bigger sound. I doubt the same animal made a huge boulder scraping sound. It sounded like it was sliding down the mountainside, and the deer didn't run, and then that same creature made a normal growl sound from the same place, and that was what scared the deer off. I don't know what I believe about this, but it was certainly a strange experience. Also, this was one of the few times that me and my girlfriend had been on this trail together, and never had any strange experiences. I myself had been there several dozens of times over the course of many years, and also had never experienced anything remotely weird, even towards the nighttime. So this happened about 7 years ago. I was around 19 or 20 and I was a scout leader. We had a camp in a forest. The nearest city was about 10 to 15 minutes drive. Every year in July, we would have an international scout camp. Scouts from different European countries would join us. I was in the preparations team, and we would go around 2 to 3 weeks in advance to clean and put the tents up. In the preparation team, we had around 20 people. 10 to 12 men, and the rest women. We were all in our late teens or early 20s. If anyone has been a scout, you might know that the first thing in a camp is setting up a flag. The flag is an important part of this camping game. Other scouts would constantly try to steal the flag. If they managed to steal, then the lost team would have to go home. This never actually happened. No one was ever sent home. It was just a rule to keep other members involved and willing to protect the flag. Therefore, we had to constantly keep an eye or a guard near the flag. Other games involved attacking other teams and kidnapping members. All fun and games, nothing violent or harsh. It was fun and made us to be alert 24/7. So here's where my creepy story begins. One night, our preparation team was done with everything. The other 2 countries from Europe, about 60 people, were set to arrive in the morning. We had nothing to do, so we set up a campfire and started singing and talking. We had our guards, people from the team, set up in different locations. 2 near the flag, 2 near the entrance, and 2 in the woods facing the river. So we were tired and decided to go to sleep. We would change guards every 2 hours. Each guard had a whistle. If an animal or a person was to come to the camp, they would blow a certain note of a whistle as to alarm danger. That night, I was an hour into sleep when I heard a whistle. We all woke up and ran to the team member who had whistled. She claimed she saw 3 white figures running fast in the forest near the set-up tents. We thought that the morning teams arrived early and sneaked in to steal the flag or kidnap a member. So we all decided to stay awake and go into defense mode. We each stood guard in different locations watching for any signs. After some time, we started hearing whistles from the deeper parts of the forest. We also started hearing radio sounds from different places. We saw some guys in white shirts running around in the forest. Me and 2 other people decided to check the empty tents to see if there were people hiding in the empty tents, but we couldn't find anyone. Then we started walking around, and we heard loud laughter from a bush near us. It sounded like a woman laughing. So we started laughing too, as we thought we found another scout team near the bush. Naturally, we walked to the bush without any hesitation. To our horror, there was no one there. Then we heard more noises from another bush that was a little bit deeper into the woods. Then we heard a clear conversation between a few people, speaking in a French accent. We could hear them clearly, so we checked, and again, nothing. Then we saw a guy in a white t-shirt running fast again in front of us, but his speed was weird. He was running so fast as if he was sliding. Keep in mind, we were in the woods at night with no lights. There's no way that someone can run without making a noise. But somehow, this guy was running so quietly. It really seemed like he was just sliding. Again, we still didn't feel threatened. We just had an adrenaline rush, but it was more excitement to catch them than anything else. After all, we just wanted the fun to begin. We were excited to see the teams again and have fun. For the next 2 or so hours, we kept hearing whistles and whispers in French, but we couldn't find a single person. It was so clear that there were a lot of people hiding around us, but we couldn't even catch one of them. They were so fast and so sneaky. This is important to mention that the arriving teams were not from France, so it was weird to hear them speak in French. Anyways, after 2 hours of running in the forest in the dark, I got tired. I didn't take this too seriously, so myself and a couple of my friends went back into our tent to rest. I laid down, and after 10 minutes, I saw a car light speeding towards us. This area is not designed for regular cars to drive. None of us or the other teams had cars. A bus from the nearby city would drop us there and pick us up after the camp was over. We heard a car coming straight towards our tents with high beams on. It was coming so fast that we were frozen, expecting it to hit us at any moment. It happened so fast that we couldn't even run. Then suddenly, it just stopped right near our tent. We heard the door open but heard no footsteps. Whoever it was just closed the door and left. We were shaking, and at that moment it hit me that it couldn't have been anyone from the other teams. We got out and learned that our other teammates also had seen a Jeep speeding towards our tent, but didn't see anyone coming out of the car. After this, we just decided to stay awake until morning. Throughout the entire night, we kept seeing these white-shirted men sliding around us. We couldn't see any faces. They were fast and weird. We could hear loud laughters and French whispers all around our camp. We could tell that there were a lot of strangers near the camp who were either messing around with us or had plans to hurt us. The sun came up, and the strange things stopped. We didn't manage to catch anyone or figure out who they were. And in the morning, the other teams finally arrived. We had this leaderboard meeting every afternoon where we would discuss daily plans and meals. Also, we would share about any planned or failed attacks. All the team leaders said that they arrived in the morning, so they were not even in the country at night. Up to this day, I have no idea who those people were. I have no idea what they wanted or what their plans were. They never attacked or kidnapped anyone in the team. It was scary when I think of it. What would happen if we didn't have guards that night? What would happen if we were all asleep? At the end of the day, This was a campsite in a wooded area, and woods can be places where cults and crazy people gather. I was doing a property inspection in the winter as the sun went down. I do basic CAD drawings of properties for title companies, so I have to measure all the buildings and show where they set, show driveways, easements, and whatnot. This property was an abandoned pig farm in the middle of nowhere, with a house and a number of large farm buildings. The house was left with the doors standing open, and being curious, I stepped in and looked around. I had an immediate feeling of repulsion. There was an odor that was off, but that wasn't it. I just knew something bad had gone here, and I left to start measuring. It was getting dark. When I measure buildings, I have a measuring wheel and have to keep my head up to see when I'm parallel with the end of a wall. So I was hurrying through the work when I tripped on something and fell in the snow. I had a headlamp on, and in the snow, staring up, eyes open, not 1.5 feet from my face, is a frozen dead dog with an obvious bullet wound on the side of its head. I actually let out a gasp/scream thing that was pathetic. It scared the ever-loving crap out of me. This happened to me over the weekend during a hunting trip. I spent last night trying to Google and figure out what the heck I saw. I haven't found anything that doesn't seem like conspiracy craziness, so I'm open to any suggestions. A family friend has a few hundred acres in Tennessee. Once a year, my dad, uncle, and myself, and the guys in the family that own the land go on a week-long hunting trip. They have a cabin and a trailer tucked away at the edge of the mountain that we stay at during the week. There is no running water, and we use a generator for lights during the evening. Phone service is non-existent out there. The nearest town is Murphy, Tennessee, which is about 50 minutes away by car. Typically, we get out to tree stands/ground blinds at around 4 a.m., and then come back to the camp around 9-ish, grab something to eat and nap, and then head back to hunt until sundown. All week, my uncle and I hunted the same plot. It was on the east side of the property and took about 20 minutes by four-wheeler. We would park the four-wheeler in this big clearing, and then the ground blind I was hunting from is another 15 minutes or so by foot. It's a rough 15 minutes too. I basically walk along this ridge line on the side of the mountain, and the blind is set just inside the underbrush of a tree line that overlooks an opening at the start of a river. My uncle was hunting in a blind that was a little closer walk and probably 30 minutes away from me. We hunted the same spot Sunday through Thursday. Thursday evening, we were all drinking beer and hanging out by the fire. My uncle, having not seen anything all week, wanted to go to the plot my dad was hunting. It was a 30-minute walk from the camp. You don't even need a four-wheeler to get there. I had killed a deer the first afternoon there and seen a bunch of does that evening right before sunset, so I wanted to stay where I was. So Friday morning after we hunted, I helped him pack up his blind and ride it out to the plot that my dad had been on, and helped him get set up for that evening. I took the four-wheeler by myself that afternoon and continued hunting the same ground blind. Same thing as I had done all week. Everything was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until Saturday morning. I had gone out by myself again that morning and had watched a bunch of deer that crept up right before the sun started coming up. They were a bit further than I wanted to shoot, and when they got closer to the edge of the river, they weren't big enough or were too young for me to justify shooting. I watched them until they retreated back into the woods, and at this point, it's probably 8:30 a.m. or so, and the sun is fully up. Now, this is an embarrassing one for me, but oh well. Having spent almost an entire week packed in this trailer with two other guys and no privacy, I decided that I was going to have a little fun before I went back to the camp. Every hunter has done it. I don't care if you admit to it or not. Now, I'm sitting there doing my thing, and even though nobody ever walks up while you're hunting out there, I'm still on high alert. making sure that I don't get caught by one of the guys while I'm doing this. I'm laid back in this chair inside of the blind, basically one eye looking in front of me, and every now and again peeking behind me through the mesh to make sure that no one's coming. That's when I started hearing crunching. I knew it was people's footsteps, and I could tell that it was more than one person. It was to my right, and the mesh of my ground blind and underbrush kept me from being able to see who it was. I calmly got myself ready and quietly leaned up so that when my uncle or whoever it was came up, I could act like I was just sitting there hunting. Keep in mind, we are so far out in the sticks that it never even occurred to me that it could be anybody other than someone that I was hunting with. I listened to them walking, and finally, I slowly stood up and poked my head through the blind and peeked over the underbrush. It was 4 people walking towards the river in a line. They were wearing these black cloak-looking clothes, like something they wear in Harry Potter, with these furry hats that covered most of their faces. It looked like some weird cult, but the guy in the back of the line was completely naked. He looked disgusting. His hair was curly and way too long, and he had a big beard that looked nasty, like it had a bunch of leaves and stuff in it. I'm bundled up with hand warmers in my pockets because it's like 25 to 30 degrees out. This guy had to be freezing. No shoes either. This is thick underbrush that we're talking about walking through. Rocks jutting up from the ground and stuff. No sane person is out there barefoot, much less completely naked. The guy had to be 115 pounds too, just completely unhealthy looking, like these people that had been keeping him prisoner or something. The sight of these guys was so unnerving to me that I was still standing there frozen in an awkward half stand, half bent over position, with my head out of the blind watching them, before it clicked with me that I needed to slowly sit down. At that point, they had passed the point of the blind where I couldn't see them, and were walking with their backs to me, towards the river. I slowly sat down, and put my rifle in my lap, and watched them all step ankle deep into the river. They were facing side profile away from me, towards the woods. And I could see 2 of the clothed people moving around the naked guy, and one of them was standing still, holding their arm out in front of them. I got the nerve to look through my scope at them, and it looked like 2 of them were washing the guy with the river water, and the other one holding their arm out like a chain or something. The one holding the chain was talking, but way too far for me to hear any of it. After a few minutes, the 2 doing the washing stopped, and all 3 of them held hands around the naked guy and started moving in a circle around him, while he just stood there staring ahead. They did this for at least 5 minutes. That doesn't seem that long of a time, but 5 whole minutes of watching whatever the heck that was seemed like a lifetime. Something of note that clicked with me last night. Whatever they were doing seemed time-based. My watch beeped at 9 o'clock and nearly gave me a heart attack. No way that they could hear it, but in my head, I was picturing them all turning and looking at me. But right after my watch beeped, they stopped a few seconds later, at 9 on the dot. The 3 clothed people stepped back in a line in front of the naked guy, and they walked back the way they came, exactly like they came in. None of them talked or broke the line while they were walking. It was terrifying because the way out for them was the first time I could truly have been in their line of sight. They never saw me though, and I watched them once they passed my head back up the mountain from where I assumed they originally came from. I waited for 30 minutes or so and booked it out of there fast. This story takes place in Navarre, Spain. When fall comes around, woods get packed with people trying to gather all sorts of edible mushrooms. It's a pretty popular thing to do in Spain, since they can get pretty expensive once you purchase them at any grocery store. Anyways, he goes all by himself, like he's done multiple times. But after a couple of hours, notices that he can no longer recognize where he is. It's getting dark, and there's no service at all, so he's screwed. He starts panicking. My uncle calls 112. It's the European equivalent of 911, because that's the only thing you can call when there's no service. They can track his position, but they aren't able to send any forest rangers yet. After getting off the phone with 112, an older guy pops out of nowhere, and mind you, he's super deep in. He just straight up tells my uncle that in order to get out, he needs to take this certain path. He starts walking that direction, and the old guy just disappears out of nowhere. Turns out he was right, because he was able to get out. To this day, he doesn't know if it was a hallucination or if the man was real, but he made it out safely. So at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Out back of my neck of the woods is an old dirt road. It's hard to access unless you know how to take a turn down another old road that runs around the back of the coal mine that I work at. Anyhow, if you follow that old road until you get to a T intersection, you can either turn right out to Hale Creek or left, which will take you out to Mount Coulon. Now, Mount Coulon isn't much of a town anymore. It's an Outback pub and that's it. There used to once be a town there, but everyone upped and left once the railway line got moved to the coast. That was the only reason the town existed for so long. Or, for as long as it did. It wasn't the start of the town, though. Way back in the early 1900s, gold was found in them there hills by a prospector named Thomas Coulon. He staked his claim and settled there with his family. Some local aboriginals found him and his family living on their land, and weren't too happy about it. So they attacked his home, throwing rocks through the windows and antagonizing him. Well, Thomas went out and shot the lot of them, all dead, then in a fit of grief over what he had done, sat down on his porch and unalived himself all over the wall behind him. Fast forward to the year 2021. I was working out at Hale Creek Mine at the time on the maintenance crew. I'd had a big 7 nights of 12-hour shifts and had very little sleep. I had left my mining camp the following afternoon, still not feeling the best, but set out for the long drive back home to Moranbah. Anyhow, dusk came along, then nightfall. I was driving for what seemed like forever, trying to make my way back home. I was constantly looking out for the turnoff on the old back road that ran up behind Goonyella Mine, but it never came. I kept on driving and driving. Hours went by. I was on a very unfamiliar road. It started to bend and twist and turn all over, and narrow to the point that my little Kia Rio could barely get out without making the scratches on branches of old looming trees hanging over the road. I was definitely lost. So I pulled over to check my Google Maps. No signal. Of course. I was so confused. Did I miss the turn? I thought maybe it's a little further up, so I pressed on and kept driving. Then, out of nowhere, I see an old and worn sign off to the left of me on the side of the old dirt road, Mount Coulon 15K. I thought, okay, I've gone way too far out in the sticks. Better turn around. Before I could, though, I saw off to my right the entrance to what looked like a cemetery with an old and rusty archway. And above on the archway was in rusty, wrought iron lettering, Betsy's Rest. Well, my curiosity got the better of me, so I veered in there to have myself a quick squiz. Sure as crap, there was a road that went into a giant U-shape around an old cemetery, full of tombstones. Generations of cattle farmers and jackaroos, etc., who all must have worked on the various stations in the area. It gave me the spooks pretty bad, so I got out of there quick and made my way back onto the old back road. I kept heading back from whence I came, hoping and praying that I'll find this bloody T intersection. Over an hour passed, and then my worst fear happened. The fuel light flickered on my dashboard. I'm driving on this road in the absolute middle of nowhere. It's now midnight. No one will probably find me for days if I ran out of fuel. I was absolutely beside myself. This is the outback of Australia. You run out of fuel, water, or food in the outback, you've just signed your own death certificate. Done and dusted. All I had was a couple of sandwiches that I took from the camp mess hall and a bottle of water. Better than nothing, but not enough to last a couple of days stranded on the side of an old back road with no phone signal. So I kept cruising along, being extremely careful not to go too quickly or over-accelerate around all the twists and turns. As I'm driving along this lonely road, I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye. I think nothing of it though, keeping focused on the road ahead. Then I hear it, swooping and whooshing noises above my car. What? I look up and see what I can only describe as a giant bat creature with red eyes flying directly above my car. It startles me and makes me accelerate at a rapid rate. Yet, it's flying overhead, gliding effortlessly, and keeping in pace with me. I'm watching my speedometer, reaching neck-breaking speeds, and I'm bouncing all over the old and bumpy dirt road, while this creature glides down to my driver's side window, looks inside at me and grimaces. Then, just as it does, it flies up and disappears into the night air as quickly as it had appeared. I floored that old clunker of a car of mine until the heart leapt with joy at the sign of life in that desolate hellscape. I saw the Gunyella mine, CHPP's lights cut through the vast and empty void of darkness. I knew then and there that I was within 10 to 15 kilometers of the intersection and turn off back home. And sure as heck, I found it. Anyhow, I managed to get all the way back home, and I'm very grateful that my clunker ran on the oily rag and the vapors in my tank kept me alive. I told my partner at the time all about the nightmare I had been through, as she had been expecting me home the evening prior, and it's now 6 a.m. in the morning. My phone was full of missed calls from her, which I apologized profusely for. I hadn't even thought to check my phone as I had no signal for the better part of this entire journey. Well, that was part one. Part two is the next story that I have about Mount Coolon, the actual experience I had when my partner and I convinced ourselves to drive all the way out there one night, just to see the actual town. If you're interested in hearing that story, let me know. Have a good one. Mount Coolon, Part 2. Months had passed. I kept having recurring nightmares about that vile winged creature. It had entered my dreams. I woke up one night sweating in bed. My heart rate was racing. My partner asked what's wrong. Again? I had just been waking her up super late at night when I would have this horrible nightmare. This whole situation had impacted me. The desolate hellscape would reemerge in the dark nights, plagued by the old Outback road menacing my demise with the off chance that I would make one wrong move and come undone escaping that creature. Something had to be done, and I knew what I needed to do. You see, I'm a man that'll openly admit that I can't overcome anything in life unless I face it head on. That's the only way I know. No use sticking your head in the sand and pretending things will just go away. So I spoke with my partner, and after much discussion, we both agreed that we would go back and investigate the back road to Mount Coolon, and investigate the town itself. And to really drive the nail in, we were going to do it at night. I needed answers. I needed to know what lay at the end of that old road, and whatever else I may have missed on my first misadventure. We set out at 6:30 p.m., and headed for the old back road, which now is inaccessible. You can go take a look for yourself, but the mine has shut the gate, as it runs along the inside of the mine's boundary. Anyhow, we were driving my partner and mine's, at the time, new Mitsubishi Mirage. It was a really beast of a car, but it had all the kit that we needed for a long drive, and we made sure that we left prepared. We had food, water, and snacks, my toolkit in case of a breakdown, torches, a first aid kit, a two-way radio, and a battery pack for phones and the two-way radio, my trusty hunting knife, which I kept in my side door compartment, as if I was going out there again completely unarmed with God knows what lurking out there in the dark. The first leg of our adventure was rather fun. I felt a bit like Colin McRae taking the old dirt road that twisted and turned in all directions, slithering my way up to the T intersection. Once we got to the intersection, I took the left turn to head north and gradually west. The familiar road was as it was the same night that I encountered the strange flying beast. Except tonight brought a slight amount of comfort as there was a full moon in the night sky, illuminating the surrounds and edges of the road. As we approached the old cemetery, I told my partner to look right. She was in awe. I asked if she wanted to go take a look, but she was too nervous about it, so I kept on driving along. As the night went on, we came to the point of no return. The road became nothing more than a dirt track interspersed with sealed sections the local farmers had laid prior to and after crossing old relics of bridges. They were rusty and wrought iron, sturdy, but foreboding at the same time. We crossed 2 of them on one stretch. One built over the coalfields railway line, heading eastward to the port. Another was over a deep ravine. The bottom was clouded by dense native plants. The road got very narrow and snaked right and left and down and up. We were in unfamiliar territory now, and I was growing apprehensive about what I would see or find. At one point, I swore that there was no road at all. We were basically driving through a wide open field, and I had to drive at 40 kilometers per hour max to avoid any ruts or depressions in the ball dust. I was starting to think this entire trip might have been a mistake, when the road then came good again to compacted dirt. A random sign appeared off to the right of the road, stating that we were now deep in Aboriginal land, and that was how it would remain until the ends of its time. The drive went on and on. Hours had passed. Were we any closer to our destination? For reference, I switched the car's function from Bluetooth headset to radio to scan the FM/AM for any signs of life. Nothing. I thought, well, I'll check again in an hour. An hour had passed, so I checked again, scanning. A muffled and distorted voice emitted through our car, and then the sweet sound of music. It was AC/DC's Highway to Hell. How befitting, I thought to myself. I said to my partner, "Right, love. Check the signal on your phone now." She replied, 2 bars. She immediately checked Google Maps. I parked the car in this small spot of salvation while it loaded up. According to Google Maps, we were approximately 30 minutes away from a fork in the road. One way heading west out to the Never Never. Another heading towards Mount Coulon. Good thing we checked. So we headed onwards, and sure enough, there it was, the fork in the road. No signage indicating which way to go. Just one road slightly more compact than the other, and wider. So we kept true to the road that we were on, and then came a faint glimmer in the distance. A faint yellow light on the horizon. As we approached the light, it developed into a service station. Off to the left of the old dirt road, with a storefront that looked completely empty, save for a cash register on the countertop. We were now at the main intersection. Signage indicating to head right was to head towards Collinsville, left out west into the Never Never. I came to a stop off to the right shoulder of the road on a dirt patch made by trucks that had turned here before. I checked the fuel gauge, half a tank. I looked into that old run-down service station, scanning the area for any other signs of life, outside of the faint yellow glow of the iridescent tube lights, above the old and rusted Bowsers that looked like they hadn't been used since the 80s. Then I saw a figure emerging from a back room. It was a frail old woman, her hair tattered and distressed. It looked like we had awoken her. The time was now 11:30 p.m. She came to a stop inside the abandoned storefront and just stood there, staring at her car. I thought, better come forwards and ask if there's any chance of fueling up. So I pulled in and rolled down my window. She came outside into the night air and approached me with a great deal of hesitation. "Excuse me, I'm so sorry if we woke you. We were just wondering if you had any fuel." She stood there, glaring and studying me, her face withered from the harsh Outback climate. No fuel here. You better leave, now." Something felt off. There was a tension between us. And so I said, okay, thank you. So sorry. We'll leave now. Thanks again anyhow, and sorry again. So I wound the window up and got out of there. We drove around the old pub in the center of what was once the town. It had multiple V double road train tracks parked all around it, almost like they were protecting the pub itself with a wall of steel and rubber in the desolate darkness. A picnic table with a tin roof cover appeared on the right of the massive loop road, the only road in the entire area that was sealed, and even it was rather narrow. Thanks for reading. I'll post part 3, our return trip, directly after this. Here is part 3, our return trip. In part 2, we had discovered the heart of Mount Coulon, an old Outback pub / general store / post office. The most notable thing that I'll say about this pub is that it had an amazing veranda. It fully encompassed the exterior ground level and was solid hardwood varnished. Whoever owns the pub has taken great care to preserve it, as it's all that really remains of the town bar, the old petrol station converted into an old couple's new home. Anyhow, where we left off. As for lighting, what lighting? This place was clearly not welcoming after dark, albeit for 2 streetlights in the entire area that glowed faintly, only illuminating small patches of the loop road. You definitely wouldn't want to be out there with no headlights. We did the brief tour of all that was out there, then made our way back towards the road back home. My partner said hold up, so I came to a stop, again, off to the side of the road back out to the Maramba. She had just discovered on Google Maps a quicker way back home. This would take us out on that old dirt road, out west in the fork in the road. However, as you continue down that road for 50 kilometers, you'll come to another fork in the road. Taking the leftward track will take us to the Gunyella Road, which then headed back home. Good on ya, I said to her. So on we went. The Mitsubishi ran on an oily rag too. It was only a little 4-cylinder powerhouse like my Kia Rio, so I felt confident that we'd make it back. On the drive back, it was another long and slow slog. At some points, I'd have to slow to 20 kilometers per hour to make it around tight bends and twisting and turning through the roughened thoroughfare, which went wide open cattle farming properties. Then, at points, the bushland would thicken around creeks and runoff areas, and you couldn't see a meter off the sides of the road. After taking the leftward turn, in what was a slight fork in the road, we made our way homebound, and then it happened. A large creature came bounding out from the dense bushland and right out in front of our car. I came to an abrupt stop, and there in our headlights was a massive cow. It looked at us, then took off back into the bushland. I was a little stunned. That was close. Too close. So on we went back home. The rest of our journey was rather mundane to say the least. The only exception was an interesting stretch of road that had been well sealed and snaked through dense bushland. I was impressed by the craftsmanship of how well compacted it was. Then suddenly we were back on dirt road again. Hours on, and we made it to the Gunyella Road. Intersections with lighting signaling the turnoffs to local mines and explosive factories that make the bomb products for them, and so on and so forth. The usual akin of the cold fields. Then we made it home as the first light of morning emitted from the horizon. Pulling into our driveway, we both looked at each other, shrugged as if to signal, what the heck was that all about? Then got out of the car and headed inside. It's a strange feeling out there. It's the desolation, I think. The lack of. It's what really drives the tension, I guess. Any moment can be fraught with demise, but it gave me the closure that I needed to put the rest, the monsters in my head. Whatever I saw that night, when I made that near-fatal misadventure, will remain a mystery. And maybe that is for the best. This happened last night, and I'm still pretty freaked out. We're up at my father-in-law's for Christmas. He lives in South Jersey, in a pretty remote area just north of Bern State Forest. It's quiet, and always a little eerie, but felt especially weird with the overcast weather and unseasonable warmth of the last few days. We did Christmas dinner at my brother-in-law's and got back pretty late. Because of the radiator heat and outside temps, we slept with the window open. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard a low wail, building in volume for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. Figuring it was just an odd-sounding bird and trying to go back to sleep. It happened twice more over the course of maybe 5 minutes. I was basically able to put it out of my head and start drifting back to sleep when I heard a loud, shrill blast, like a too-high elephant's trumpet. At that point, I shot up, my heart racing. I knew I had to close the window and took a beat to build up to it. When I dragged myself out of bed, I peeked through the shutters before I reached to shut the pane. Whatever it was had tripped the motion sensor light at the back of the property and was half illuminated, standing maybe 100 feet from the back door, right at the tree line. It was cloaked, with its head partially shrouded. The bottom of its face looked flat and round like the back of a dinner plate, with another smaller, half-uncovered black circle at its center. I immediately slammed the window shut and it didn't move, just stood there with its face tilted towards the window. I shut the blinds and crept into bed and basically hid until the sun came up. I didn't hear any more sounds. I dared another look out the window after dawn and the figure was gone, and I managed to drift back to sleep for a few hours. Has anyone seen like this or know what it might be? I've been frantically Googling, but nothing really coming up. This happened many years ago, when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area that I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded 100-plus acre ranch. The land is in the southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property, and we have family reunions every year and all stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp and cook and eat. Getting to that part of the ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story. Because I had been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember, and the land was private, my parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day, as long as I didn't get too far. I'd spend time walking the property near our camp, looking for arrowheads or trying to catch tadpoles in the ponds. On this day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going to a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp, and be back on time for a swimming trip that my cousins were planning. They wanted to go to a nearby river, and I really didn't want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock, or circle around on a longer route with a flat trail. I'd usually go up the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle that I caught the tadpoles with, and I didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out / killing them. I had never walked along the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad, and I felt confident that I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down looking for arrowheads in the washed out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I continued walking. We all know that feeling like someone is watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked being on the trail by myself. Now, the next part I cannot explain whatsoever. It's as if a light switch was turned on, or someone snapped their fingers and I came back to reality. Except when I came to, I wasn't on the trail that I'd been on before. I was near the railroad tracks, and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where were you?" 2 things I remember really clearly about the moments I came to are, 1, the look of fear, anger, and relief on my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me. And 2, the confusion that I felt about what was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark, and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare it to a movie, The Butterfly Effect. The main character would be living in one moment, then somewhere, suddenly, he'd wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp, and I learned that it was 10:30 p.m. This meant that I had been gone for 11 hours, about 10 and a half which I can't account for to this day. My parents and all my family had understandably freaked the heck out when I hadn't returned to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid, growing up, and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled at my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought that maybe I got lost and was too embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time that I've ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it is to not be able to account for all the hours that I was gone. Was it a coincidence that I had that creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10 and a half hours of my life? I wish that I had answers for what had happened. Has anyone had anything similar happen to them? So this is a story my dad recently told me about my grandpa and my great-grandpa. My grandpa grew up in a very rural southern Indiana, but moved to very rural southern Illinois in his youth. So this takes place in Illinois. One night, Grandpa and his dad were hanging out at his uncle's, who lived a couple of miles away. Keep in mind, this is the 40s out in the country, so all roads are just dirt, basically. Anyways, it was pretty late, so they decided to head home and hopped into their old car, going probably about 15 miles per hour through these woods roads. At some point, as they're just driving and talking, they pass something along the edge of the road, standing upright. They both hunted and were very familiar with any animals or other local people that may be around. Neither one of them really said anything for a minute, and then they both looked at each other and said, "What the hell was that?" My grandpa asked his dad, "Do you want to turn around?" And he said nope, and they kept driving. My grandpa said it resembled a big owl or a small person just standing in the ditch. Have you ever experienced anything strange in and around Florida? Apologies if this isn't allowed. I got to thinking after a couple of weird things I experienced in my hometown, and it had me thinking if anybody else has experienced anything. Back when we were teens, me and my brother were out for a walk outside of our neighborhood. Where we were walking was kind of wooded, but the houses were still pretty close together, yet considerably more in the boonies compared to our place. Anyways, we had almost completed the loop of the area, and were around the bend going towards the exit when we heard something odd. I remember there was a helicopter overhead. Around the time, we both heard this weird guttural yell/growl, like right next to us. It was so close. It sounded like a mix between a mountain lion, an angry house cat, and yet oddly human-like all at once. We both just froze and looked at each other startled, and started looking around for the source, but there wasn't a single cat or anything animal-like about. I was pretty freaked out and practically sped walked to the road. All the while, my brother kept asking me what the F that was, but I was too spooked to talk about it. It was like a primal type fear. In an instant, we heard it, and I just kept looking over my shoulder the whole way back. Anyways, pretty benign compared to the other stories I've read on here, and I'm sure there's an explanation to the sound, but it did have me wondering, has anyone else experienced weird stuff in Florida? Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Have a great night, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.